This case takes place in the UK in the year 2013. Lee Rigby was a 25-year-old British soldier from Middleton in Greater Manchester. He served as a drummer and a machine gunner. He toured Afghanistan and later performed ceremonial duties at sites like the Tower of London. By 2013. Lee had transitioned to an army recruiting role in London, where his friendly and outgoing personality made him a natural fit for engaging potential recruits. His family considered him to be a devoted soldier. His stepfather noted that he loved what he was doing, and he deeply believed in his service. Outside of work, Lee was a young father and a fiancé. Loved ones later recalled his humor and his warmth. After his dangerous service abroad, Lee's family took comfort that he was back to safety in London. Tragically, that sense of safety was soon shattered. On the afternoon of May 22, 2013, Lee was on his way back to the Woolwich barracks in southeast London. He was wearing a hoodie emblazoned with the charity Help for Heroes, which is a charity that supports wounded veterans. At approximately 20 p.m. as Lee crossed the road, a speeding car suddenly swerved and struck him from behind. Witnesses later described the car carrying him down the road before crashing into a signpost. The impact knocked Lee unconscious by all accounts. He was incapacitated on the ground and unable to defend himself. This was no accident, and what followed was a brutal and frenzied attack in full view of midday onlookers. Inside this car were two men, 28-year-old Michael Adebolayo and 22-year-old Michael Adebile. These cowardly individuals emerged from the vehicle, armed with a cleaver and knives. Once they got out of the car, the men set upon Lee with horrifying violence, so horrifying that it became one of Britain's most notorious cases. One of the attackers began hacking at Lee's neck with a meat cleaver in a deliberate attempt to behead him, while the other stabbed and cut at his torso. Eyewitnesses would later recall that these actions were like a butcher attacking a joint of meat. Within moments, seconds, in fact, Lee suffered extensive and serious injuries, and tragically he died at the scene. However, the attackers were not done yet. They wanted to make what they had done into a public spectacle. The two men dragged Lee's body into the middle of the road, right in front of oncoming traffic, and horrified bystanders. They didn't flee. They stood right where they were, brandishing their blooded weapons and encouraging people to come and look at what they had done. Some witnesses at first thought they were seeing an accident. One incredibly brave woman by the name of Ingrid Loy Kenneth jumped off of a bus and intended to render first aid to Lee, but she soon realized the truth of the situation. This was no accident. This was a deliberate and gruesome act of murder. However, Ingrid didn't run. Instead, she tried to talk to the men and tried to persuade them to put down the weapons, but they refused. One of the killers then explained why they did what they did, stating clearly, "I killed him because he killed Muslims in Iraq and Afghanistan." Ingrid then did something quite remarkable. She kept talking to the men to prevent further attacks, hoping that by distracting them, they would stop the violence, at least until the police arrived. And so she kept talking to the men, even as she stood mere feet from Lee's body, and as the men stood there, with weapons that could kill her in literal seconds. What's strange is that the two attackers then warned Ingrid to stay back. They told her, "We don't want to hurt any women or children," indicating that they saw their violence as directed at only military targets. They saw this as a legitimate and fair attack. Another to passers-by also came closer to the scene. Amanda Donnelly and her daughter Gemini Donnelly. They bravely approached Lee's body, while the attackers still lingered nearby. They ignored the danger, crossed the road, and knelt beside him. Amanda tried to cover his body with her coat, shielding him from any further harm, while Gemini crouched close and spoke softly to him. She later said, "I couldn't just walk away and leave him there. I wanted to show Lee that someone cared." Neither of these women backed away. As you can imagine, during this time, panic ensued. People literally couldn't believe their eyes. Bystanders pulled out their phones to film, whilst others called the police. In fact, the two killers actually asked the bystanders to call 999, and they just waited for the authorities to arrive. But then, one of the killers noticed one person who was filming and took this as an opportunity to give a statement. On camera, he declared, "The only reason we have killed this man today is because Muslims are dying daily by British soldiers." He said that this killing was an eye for eye, tooth for tooth revenge. The killer then apologized to the women that they had to witness such carnage, but then added, "In our land, our women have to see this same thing." The killers then urged the people of Britain to remove their government and to force the troops to come home so that everyone can live in peace. One witness later described that the killers had a look of pure evil in their eyes, and that before people intervened, the two had tried to remove Lee's organs. The people who risked their own safety to tend to Lee, and who attempted to distract the killers so they didn't desecrate his body further, are true heroes. Metropolitan Police officers were soon dispatched, and they arrived at the scene at 2:29 p.m. However, one of the killers had with them a gun. Armed police were also dispatched, and they arrived at 2:34 p.m. As soon as the armed police vehicle pulled up, the two men ran at the officers. Seeing them, too, as legitimate targets, one of the attackers then aimed the revolver at the police. The armed officers had no choice but to open fire, discharging a total of 8 shots. Both men fell to the ground. The one holding the gun had their thumbs blown off by the police. Even after being shot, Aidbawal raised his handgun and tried to fire. However, he was using a rusty, old gun that was no longer capable of firing. Once the area was secured, armed officers administered first aid to the killers. Paramedics then soon arrived. Both men were taken under guard to hospital for emergency treatment. Remarkably, no bystanders or police were harmed in the confrontation. Paramedics also rushed to Lee, but tragically it was far too late. His injuries were unbelievably graphic. An extensive array of evidence was recovered at the scene: the knives, the meat cleaver, and the gun. In the hours and days immediately after the murder, police and security agencies launched a major investigation. Raids were carried out at multiple addresses associated with the suspects, including locations in Greenwich, Rumford, North London, and Lincolnshire. They wanted to know if anyone else was involved. Over the next week or so, several associates of the men were arrested on suspicion of conspiracy to murder, though ultimately none of these people were charged with aiding the murder. By May 31st, 2013, just over a week later, both of the killers had been discharged from hospital and into police custody. They were promptly charged with Lee's murder. But everyone wanted to know who were these men. Michael Adebolayo, the older of the two perpetrators, was 28 years old at the time of the murder. He was born in December of 1980 and raised in Rumford, East London by all accounts. He grew up in a loving Christian household. In fact, his parents were church-going and gave him a relatively stable upbringing. It was around 2000 that he converted to Islam. At the age of 18, throughout the two, he became increasingly involved with hardline Islamist networks in the UK and, notably, befriended an extremist called Anjem Choudhury. The British authorities were well aware of him. In 2010, he traveled to Kenya, intending to link up with a terror group. Kenyan anti-terror police ended up arresting him, and he later claimed that he was tortured and even essayed by Kenyan authorities. During his detention following this whole debacle, he was deported back to Britain. This incident greatly concerned MI5, which is Britain's domestic security service. Upon his return, MI5 interviewed him, and they even attempted to recruit him as an informant. As you can imagine, Adebolayo refused. At this point, he was beyond indoctrinated. Following this, he claimed that MI5 harassed him for some time. Some experts believe that this only radicalized him further against the British state. According to their reports, Adebolayo posed no immediate threat, a judgment that tragically proved false by May of 2013. As for the other killer, Michael Adebolayo, he was the junior in the attack. He was just 22 years old on this day. He was born in May of 1992 in the London district of Greenwich. His upbringing was somewhat less stable. His mother worked as a probation officer, and his father was a government trade diplomat at the Nigerian High Commission in London, although his parents separated shortly after he was born, and he grew up mainly with his mother. In January of 2008, at just 16, he was the victim of a violent knife attack. He was stabbed during a fight, and another person was killed in front of him. Friends later suggested that he experienced PTSD symptoms after witnessing the murder and nearly being killed. They believe that this experience had a huge impact on his life and his mental state. By 2009, at the age of 17, Adebolayo converted to Islam, and he hung around similar extremist networks. It's here where the two killers befriended each other, and MI5 knew of Adebolayo too, and just like the other killer, he was not categorized as an immediate threat. By his late teens and early 20s, he was firmly under the sway of extremist ideology, but it's noted that he was more withdrawn and less outspoken publicly. He struggled with his mental health. According to his family, his use of illegal substances induced episodes of psychosis in him, and at one point, he was even prescribed medication to combat this. His own mother had even sought help for him. Due to his erratic behavior, it appears that Aidbyle's radicalization may have been influenced by both ideological measures and by personal anguish. According to people that knew him, he struggled to fit in, which was compounded by his earlier trauma and drug use. But here's something that's incredibly frustrating. In December of 2012, he chatted with a man overseas on Facebook and asked them how to go about killing a soldier. Now, by this point, MI5 were already aware of him, and they should have been monitoring him more closely, but they didn't. British authorities only found out about this after the killing had occurred. Half a year later, Aidbyle would do just this. The trial of the two killers opened at the Old Bailey in London in late November of 2013. Just 6 months after the attack, both men pleaded not guilty. The defense had some serious challenges. The prosecution had robust evidence, including CCTV footage, eyewitness testimony of the attack, the suspect's unspoken admission on video, and forensic proof linking them to the crime. However, their not guilty plea wasn't an attempt to deny killing Lee. Both men openly admitted their actions, but they argued that what they did was not murder. In the traditional sense, they claimed that they were soldiers acting in a war against Britain, not criminals, and that Lee was a legitimate target because he was a member of the armed forces. Their defensive argument was that Lee was not an innocent civilian. Basically, they tried to argue that they were combatants in war and not murderers under British law. As you can imagine, this didn't go down too well in court. The jury had to watch the CCTV footage of Lee being struck by the speeding car. The clip was so disturbing that Lee's family left the courtroom in tears. As it was played, prosecutors then presented the gruesome crime scene details. Methodically, he told the court how the killers had used the car as a weapon to knock down Lee so he couldn't defend himself. Lee's injuries were also cataloged in blunt terms: multiple stab wounds near decapitation, no chance of survival. The court also heard how they had purchased a set of 5 knives and a sharpener the day before the killing, which indicated clear signs of premeditation. The prosecution also argued that there was no sane, political, or religious justification for such a heinous act. It was murder pure and simple, driven by extremism. Adebayo took to the stand, and he openly admitted to the killing. He described with pride and graphic detail how he held Lee's hair and decapitated him. Adebayo showed no signs of mental illness, and he was not diagnosed with anything. He underwent multiple psychiatric assessments before and after the trial. They found no evidence of psychosis, schizophrenia, or diminished responsibility. In fact, he was described by experts as calm, lucid, and ideologically motivated, fully aware of his actions. He told doctors and the police that he intended to die that day as a martyr, and was almost disappointed that it didn't happen. During the trial, The judge called him a self-radicalized fanatic. On the other hand, Michael Aidbile did have a documented history of mental illness. He was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia after the murder, and as we mentioned previously, he had shown symptoms of psychosis, which was worsened by his illegal substance use. During the trial, psychiatrists testified that he was fit to stand trial, and that he understood what he was doing, but that his illness may have made him more susceptible to outside influence. The judge in prosecution also took time to recognize the courage of several civilians who had faced down these killers. People like Ingrid, Amanda, and Gemini were all publicly commended for their bravery and their composure. Their conduct that day was described by police as an example of heroism, a reminder that in the middle of terror, ordinary people can act in extraordinary ways. On December 19, 2013, after just 90 minutes of deliberation, the jury found both men guilty of the murder of Lee. One of the killers reportedly blew a kiss to the sky and kissed a copy of the Quran. As he was led away, the sentencing took place. On February 26, 2014, Adebayo was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole. He was given a whole life tariff. He will never be free again. As for the younger one, Aidbile, he too was given life in prison. However, he is eligible for parole after 45 years. He was given a shorter sentence due to his mental state at the time. Both men later appealed their sentences. Adebayo argued that a whole life term was excessive, and he tried to even appeal the murder conviction, not just his sentence. Meanwhile, Abdul Walid sought a shot, a minimum tariff. He believed that his sentence was too extreme. These appeals were thankfully rejected. Over time, the two have been kept in high-security incarceration. But then in 2018, Adebayo, the more extreme of the two killers and the one who had led the attack, briefly made headlines from inside prison. When reports surfaced that he had expressed remorse, he claimed to have been brainwashed by extremist ideology and that he had misinterpreted the Quran to justify the murder of Lee. He was said to have apologized and told staff he now rejected violence, but Lee's mother publicly dismissed the idea of any genuine change of heart, telling reporters that she did not believe his regret was sincere at all. The murder of Lee in broad daylight on a London street sent shock waves through the UK. There was a spike in anti-Muslim incidents across Britain. At least 10 mosques were attacked in the immediate aftermath. In one case, a man ran into a mosque, armed with knives, and began yelling threats. In another, attackers firebombed a mosque in Grimsby with petrol bombs, and then some who followed groups, like the two killers did, claim that the killing was a legitimate act of war and not murder. Some went as far as even saying that it was deserved. There was one woman who was prosecuted for a tweet which suggested that people who wore Help for Heroes merchandise deserved to be beheaded. Tensions were incredibly high, to say the least. Muslim leaders and organizations across the UK immediately and unequivocally condemned the attacks. They expressed sympathy for Lee's family and rejected any link between the religion and the killer's actions. The Islamic Society for Britain said This was a barbaric act that goes against everything Islam stands for. We utterly reject and condemn such actions and the twisted narrative that tries to justify them. The family of Michael Adebolayo also issued a public statement. They expressed horror at what he had done and offered condolences to the Rigby family. Whilst serving his sentence, Adebolayo had to be moved to a psychiatric hospital as he was suffering greatly from paranoid schizophrenia. In 2018, while confined at this hospital, he assaulted a nurse without provocation. Despite his chance at parole, it's likely that he will never be free again, not to mention that it would be far too dangerous for him to be released. Anyway, too many people would come looking for him. As of 2025, both men remain behind bars. Adebolayo, in particular, is considered to be among the most notorious criminals in modern UK history.